Education Series webinar. We are excited that you're joining us. The sunshine here in our local area is out, and so we know that you could be doing a lot of other things, but I am grateful that you're here because this is going to be a very special treat, and we're excited that you could join us. Today, again, is one of those interactive events that we love to do here at Remedy Live, and we're so grateful to partner with the LookUp Indiana Initiative and the Lutheran Foundation to bring today's event to you. But as you opted in, you noticed we're already asking you questions. We've asked you the all-important question, how are you? And I'm grateful to say that maybe the sunshine is really making a difference. We are doing well, and we love that. But of course, it's okay to not be okay, and that's why we're talking about mental health on a regular basis, and we're so thankful to be able to do that. The platform today is going to ask you a bunch of questions, and today our guest is going to be asking us a number of trivia-related questions about this topic that we're going to be discussing. So you're going to want to be in that polling, and you're going to want to be answering quickly and correctly. You have 20 seconds to answer those questions a little bit later on in our time together. And you'll notice the question pop up on your screen. Choose your answer. You'll notice there's a little nickname underneath the video player. Look for your nickname on the leaderboard so you can see if you're one of our top 3 winners today. You are going to have a chance to win a wonderful book from our speaker today, but also some Amazon gift cards from Remedy Live, which everyone likes to have those to be able to buy things they need. So grateful for that. Always want you to know that our Wired experience is available to you anywhere in the country. We love providing these interactive experiences where we talk about mental health with your congregation through a webinar much like this, polling and all that good stuff. But it is an anonymous platform so that we can ask the questions that sometimes maybe are difficult to answer. And so we want to make sure you know that that's available to you. And it's a simple way to be able to sign up. All you have to do is go to our website at remedylive.com/wired to learn more about that. And we would love to be able to serve you. Dennis, it's good to be back with you. We haven't seen each other very much recently. We just joked about getting some lunch on the patio somewhere now that we can without parkas.
Yes, and maybe without mask on the patio as well.
Hey,
yeah,
after April 6th, maybe that's an option. I love that. Today is a special day, not only to be together, but to engage, again, our audience, our church leaders, people of our community that are involved in leadership roles on this important topic of mental health. What do we got in store for us today?
We are so thankful to have Dr. Stephen Gerchovich with us as a presenter today. Dr. G is the president and founder of Key Ministries, and Key Ministry collaborates with church leaders, professionals, organizations around the country, both nationally and internationally, specifically related to disability ministry. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, an experienced clinician, teacher, researcher, has done numerous presentations, a past recipient of the Exemplary Psychiatrist Award from NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. His first book came out a few years ago, Mental Health and the Church, and this is the book that we're going to give away at the end for our top 3 winners. I've read through that. Great information, very practical. We're just thankful for these partnerships that we have with people all around that I'm just humbled that we have the opportunity to connect with.
Well, I like Dr. G because he's a hockey fan. So welcome to our LookUp Education Series, Dr. G.
Appreciative of the Lutheran Foundation for giving me this opportunity to share on a topic I'm very passionate about.
Excellent. That's great. Well, like I said, we're going to ask some questions to our audience today, give them a chance to be able to, or give you a chance, really, as our presenter, to know how they feel about this topic. And I've got 3 questions for you, guests, that you are going to get pushed to your device. You get 20 seconds to answer each question. Like I said, there is an Amazon gift card up for grabs here, so you're going to want to make sure that you answer correctly. Let's start off with our very first question. And Dr. G, I'm going to kind of keep you in the loop here as to the answers that I'm seeing up here on the screen. The first question is, which of the following mental health conditions in children most increases the likelihood of their family not attending church? Would it be depression? Would it be anxiety disorders? Would it be ADHD? Or oppositional defiant disorder? And the responses are coming in. It looks like our winner thus far, it's a tie between anxiety and ADHD. As we see those answers come in, I think we've only had one person that's gotten it right so far. Diligent Pony 78 at the top of the leaderboard. And Dr. G, the answer is depression. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I will be doing a deep dive into this in the presentation today. But what I will share and what I'm hoping that we'll communicate to folks today is I want people to think about mental health ministry maybe in a different way than they ever have before. Specifically, I would argue that the disability community as a whole is probably the largest underserved population that we have in the United States relative to the church, and that families that are impacted by mental illness are by far and away the largest underserved group within that population.
Wow.
So one of the things we're going to be talking about today that I don't think a lot of folks may be, terribly aware of is the extent to which having a family member with a mental health issue interferes with one's ability to be able to be part of church.
Well, I'm so grateful for this. This is going to be exactly what we need to hear in making our churches more welcoming. Let's go to our next question. This is it. The most common request of family members of adults with serious mental illness from their churches is A, counseling services, B, referrals to community-based mental health service providers, C, pastors to speak about mental health-related topics from the pulpit, or D, mental health support groups. And it looks like our audience is choosing C, pastors to speak about mental health-related topics from the pulpit, and they are correct. And I think we have quite a few pastors that are signed up for today's webinar. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Again, do you want to say anything about that, Dr. G, or are we going to steal your thunder for today's presentation?
Well, I won't get into too much detail, but one of the big challenges or obstacles to folks, being involved with church is stigma around mental illness. And so part of why families most want their pastors to talk about this in worship services is that when the pastor's comfortable talking about mental illness, it gives people within the congregation permission to share their own struggles.
Yeah, I couldn't say it. You actually said that before we went live. Just a sermon you recently heard where it was just one of those super talks to a congregation. So,
and I remember a couple of years ago when Lifeway Research did their whole study on mental illness.
Yeah.
This is the thing that stood out for me the most. And I've said this countless times, 35 years as a pastor before coming into this role here at the Lutheran Foundation. I don't know that I ever talked about it. And I say that with humility and shame, that I should have addressed that. But this has really opened my eyes to the fact that people want to hear something from the pastor.
I don't remember in seminary being taught in my homiletics class to be vulnerable. So maybe this is today the theme of what we really need to get across. Third question, last question before Dr. G takes it away. Here it is. Which of the following is not an attribute of what we're calling a mental health friendly church? There's a few options here. A, mental health education training for pastors, staff, volunteers. B, a readily identifiable mental health ministry on the church's website. C, implementation of a church-wide mental health communication strategy. D, providing tangible services to individuals and families affected by mental illness. Or E, provision of mental health education and support groups. And it looks like we're kind of neck and neck, although a readily identifiable mental health ministry of the church's website is in the lead, and I do believe that is the correct answer. So Dr. G, before we jump into your presentation, anything you want to say about that one?
No, it sounds like we have a fairly knowledgeable group, but one of the ways in which, and we'll discuss this like over the next hour, that I think mental health ministry differs from other types of ministry, specifically other types of disability ministry, is that this is a mindset as opposed to a program. And so when we work with churches around, these kinds of issues, part of the focus in terms of like our training for them is how do you think about including people into all of the kinds of, worship services, small groups, service activities, Christian education that everybody else in the church takes part of, as opposed to starting something that would be a standalone or separate or different for folks with mental illness.
Right. Well, congratulations to Eager Pencil 10. You are the winner of some Amazon gift cards. Actually, we're going to give away 3. So Polite Mountain, well done. Charming Llama, who doesn't want a charming llama? You 3 are going to be winning Amazon gift cards from Remedy Live, but don't leave the competitive nature yet, because at the end of our time, Dr. G's got 5 more questions for us. But Dr. G, I'm really excited about this. Why your church needs a mental health inclusion strategy. We're looking forward to hearing from you today.
Well, anyway, again, thanks so much for the opportunity to share. And if you want to go ahead and like put up the slides at this point for folks who are watching. Um, so basically what my objectives are today, and this would be slide number 2, is that, we're going to talk briefly about, the available research looking at the impact of mental illness on church attendance and participation. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about, well, what are the barriers and what are the things that get in the way of, individuals and families with common struggles being part of church. I will do a very brief introduction to our inclusion model that we share when we're training churches specifically on this topic. And throw out some examples of some churches over the last year or two that are doing some like really neat and creative things in terms of advancing their mental health ministry and their outreach to their communities. So in the next slide, what you'll see is that this is a study from Clemson University that was published about 3 years ago by a sociologist named Andrew Whitehead. And the data from this study, looking at the relationship between children's disability and church attendance, actually comes from the National Children's Health Survey. And so this is a survey that the federal government conducts every 2 to 3 years with about 90,000 detailed phone interviews of families around the United States, trying to understand sort of like the prevalence of different disabilities. So when you hear statistics about like, the percentage of kids who have maybe like an autism spectrum disorder, this is a study where some of that data comes from. But interestingly enough, one of the questions that they ask as part of this study is, they ask families whether you've been able to attend a church or place of worship at any point in the last year. And so what Dr. Whitehead was doing was that he looked at 3 different cycles, 2010, 2012, 2015 of this National Children's Health Survey. So you're looking at interviews with a little bit over 250,000 families. I mean, so that the data here, is particularly impactful and meaningful. And I don't think it would be a surprise that like having a child with autism would reduce the likelihood of a family attending church by 84%. But having a child with depression makes it 73% less likely that that family will set foot in a church. Conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, 55% less likely. A child with an anxiety disorder reduces the likelihood of a family attending church by 45%. And ADHD reduces the likelihood of a family attending church by about 20%. So if you stop and think that somewhere around 1 in 5 kids in the United States have an identified mental health condition, and you think about the sheer numbers of like families that we're talking about here, that there's a very large segment of our population that's not connected with the church, when they have children who struggle with these issues. And if you go to the next slide, this data isn't quite as robust, but this came from the Baylor Religion Survey about 10 years ago. And essentially what they found was that when they were looking at weekly church attendance, that for adults with either depression or anxiety symptoms, the presence of those symptoms reduced the likelihood that they'd be a weekly church attender by about 50%. And so one of the places where we have found that people maybe struggle with sort of understanding or getting their brain around this concept, at least in the field of disability ministry, is that historically, a lot of the focus of churches when it's come down to disability outreach has been people with obvious physical disabilities. You think Johnny Erickson, Tata, Wheels for the World, the impact that her ministries had. Probably about 15 years ago, we started to see a big expansion of ministry for kids with, on the deep end of the autism spectrum, and kids with severe developmental disabilities, where it was clear that they were disabled. I mean, that they experienced significant impact of their disability in every situation, every environment, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What makes this mental health piece harder for a lot of folks and church leaders to get their minds around is that folks with mental health conditions may be disabled in some but not all day-to-day situations, and some but not all of the time necessarily. So that like when I think back to like some of the kids that I've seen in my practice, for example, where this became a huge issue, I can think about one girl who's the valedictorian of her high school class, where her father had to fly to Memphis to rescue her because her separation anxiety was such that she started developing severe panic attacks on the bus when their youth group went on a mission trip to Louisiana. Or the kid that I had who was the star quarterback of his football team, who ended up having to leave his Christian school because he was prone to agoraphobia, or he gets severe panic attacks in a situation where it's hard to like leave a confined space without drawing untoward attention to yourself. Well, chapel was required once a week, and because of his anxiety in that situation, became so overwhelming that he ended up having to leave the school, despite some interesting work by community mental health providers where they were actually going out to his church with him and his family, trying to help him as part of his therapy to be able to sit through an entire worship service without being overwhelmed with anxiety. So again, people with some of these mental health conditions may actually be functioning quite well in some areas of life, but the disability nevertheless, has a certain character where it keeps them from being able to be part of church. So if you take a look at the next slide, like one of the things for folks to think about is why would church be so hard for so many people with these common kinds of mental health conditions? And I guess like the best way that I would share for folks to think about this is that there are certain attributes associated with common mental health conditions that, because of the nature of our church culture, and when I talk about church culture, I'm describing sort of like what our expectations are for how people are going to act and interact when we get together for worship services, Christian education, small groups, serving. It makes it very hard for folks, with these mental health conditions, to be able to sort of fully engage and feel comfortable participating in the stuff that we do when we get together. So part of how we conceptualize this when we were putting together our mental health inclusion ministry model and how we would have church leaders start to think about this is that I would argue that there are 7 key barriers that get in the way. And I'm going to take a minute or two of our time today and kind of like go into a little bit of detail in terms of discussing each of them. And so the first is stigma. And this is something that we were kind of getting at, in the little quiz that we gave everybody, like at the beginning of our presentation today. It's widely known and understood that there's like stigma regarding mental illness in like the larger culture and the larger society, but it's probably worse in the church, particularly certain branches of the evangelical church, than it would be in our broader culture. And some of this goes back to like developments in terms of like the biblical counseling or nouthetic counseling movement, which was a reaction to trends that occurred in the 60s and 70s where, they started talking about, sort of like relative value, situational ethics. Everybody can decide for himself, what's wrong and what's right. And so within the more conservative church, there was this movement that developed where there were some very influential people who started trying to make the argument that what we understood as mental illness was a quote unquote spiritual problem. And that a lot, if not all of what was being described at that point as a mental illness was sin. And so, I mean, we know that because of a lot of good education, the efforts of many people, this is not sort of accepted as widely as maybe it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. But there are still a lot of places where people when they would go to church, where if your child's having like severe issues with behavior, that would be something that might be viewed or perceived as being like a parenting problem. And Jay Adams in particular, who was a Presbyterian pastor who died like within, I think, like the last month or two, who was the founder of sort of the whole biblical nouthetic counseling movement. did a lot to advance this notion within the church. And so one of the things, and you touched briefly on this Lifeway study, if you want to go to the next slide, where when I think this was like 2013, 2014, they did their study on mental illness. And one of the things that they found was that when they talked to quote unquote unchurched people, more than half of them expressed the belief that people with mental illness aren't welcome at church. I mean, so that there's a certain reputation that has gotten out into the larger community, in part because of like the negative experiences that a lot of individuals and a lot of families have had, who wrestle specifically with this issue. And I think back like to the early days of like our church's disability ministry, where we had Disability Sunday, and there were different families that got up at each of the worship services and were sharing sort of their stories and their testimony for why the ministry was so essential in terms of their family being able to be part of church. And one of the couples talked about their experience trying to find a church in Cleveland with 5-year-old and 7-year-old boys at the time with severe ADHD. And one of the comments that the mom made was that people in the church think they can tell when a disability ends and bad parenting begins. And so that they had a very difficult time because they felt very judged wherever they went. And that, fortunately for them, the church we happen to attend was very proactive in this area. And, it's really neat that the 7-year-old out of that group is now a deacon at our church. Mm-hmm. So, folks have significant gifts and talents, to be able to share with a larger population. So again, stigma is a big issue. The second one, and I would argue that this is probably the most common barrier, is related to anxiety. And for a very basic understanding of how the brains of folks with anxiety disorders are wired differently than the rest of us. Basically, people with anxiety are sort of hardwired to overestimate the level of risk in new or unfamiliar situations. And so you start thinking about what that would be like, if you're a person, who hasn't been to church for a long time or has never been to church, when you think about the struggle of just visiting for the first time. So some of the ways that we would see this play out, for example, with children would be, in a lot of churches, it's expected that kids will go to their children's programming while adults go to the worship service. Well, for kids with separation anxiety, the prospect of being, in the different part of a church building, or in a different part of a larger church campus away from their parents is, incredibly overwhelming. There are kids that I know who do well, for example, I know some kids who can't go to Sunday school, but they can go to church and they can sit with their parents for a church service. But the prospect of going away to a weekend retreat would be totally overwhelming. For teens who wrestle with these kinds of issues, where, oftentimes you're sitting there worried about how you're being viewed or scrutinized by other folks, the prospect or the expectation of self-disclosing as part of a small group would be something that would make many of them feel intensely uncomfortable. One of the places that a lot of kids will tend to fall away from church if they have an issue with anxiety is a transition from elementary school to middle school ministry, or the transition from middle school to high school ministry. You think about a shy, uncomfortable middle school kid walking into a big auditorium with a lot of loud high school kids who are already sort of clustered together and already have their peer groups. That becomes something that makes a lot of kids intensely uncomfortable. Now, if you look at the next slide, you think about some of the challenges adults would have with this. Visiting a church for the first time would be huge for someone, for example, if you're part of the 7.5% of the population, of adults in this country who have social anxiety. How many people do you meet the first time you go to a church? And if you're a person who worries that you're being excessively scrutinized, by new people that you meet, how difficult is that? one of the things that we found is that like a lot of times adults with anxiety will spend lots of time visiting church websites before they would go for the first time, because they want to see how people are going to be dressed. They desperately don't want to stand out or to be singled out as like an object of attention. Like a common fear would be that, like, folks are afraid, well, if I go to church, somebody going to stick a microphone in my face and ask me to introduce myself, like during the worship service. I know that when I was in medical school and hanging out at like the Lutheran church, like up the road from us, one of the things that went on a lot in the 1980s is that there were these obligatory church coffee hours that, where if you were a new person and expected to like, to talk to new people, for someone with social anxiety, that would make you intensely uncomfortable. Again, like given that there are so many churches where small groups are an essential part of their discipleship strategy, agreeing to go to like somebody's house that's unfamiliar with like 10 to 12 other adults that you don't know, and the expectation to talk about like very personal things in a small group, for someone with anxiety, it's going to be really difficult for them to be able to get over that particular hill. So if we go on the next slide, like the third barrier is one's capacity for self-control. And again, that there's scripture to support this. Like if you think about, like, for example, like the book of James, that we tend to equate self-control with spiritual maturity. Well, one of the things that we know is that executive functioning, which has to do with sort of our cognitive capacity to sort of regulate or exercise control over what goes on in like lower brain centers, managing impulse control, regulating emotions. We know that pretty much every mental illness can like negatively impact one's executive functioning capacity. And ADHD is probably like the model condition for this. And so that a lot of times, like folks who would struggle, with executive functioning and self-control, are viewed as being undisciplined. They don't get asked to volunteer, or they're not necessarily given the opportunity to be able to serve, at church in the way that like other people would. We talked about this issue that, again, like when you have parents who struggle with a child with self-control, that could be because of like ADHD, a real common phenomenon in a lot of our churches that are pursuing, foster care ministry or adoption ministry, is that we tend to see these self-control problems quite often in kids who've exposed to trauma. For folks who have a condition that makes it harder for them to exercise self-control, the more difficult it is to become like fully integrated into church. So that the fourth would be sensory processing. And this is typically something that we associate with folks on the autism spectrum, but it's actually associated with pretty much every different mental health disorder that's listed in the DSM. And so, there are certain things about like the physical spaces and the experiences that we have while ministry is taking place in church. You think about things like how bright the lights are, the volume of the music. Some people who are sensitive to being touched might be bothered by like hugs and handshakes that we used to do like back before COVID, or even something like the noise and the number of people talking in close proximity when someone is either arriving at or leaving church, are all things that can be like intensely distressing for folks who have sensory processing differences. The fifth is social communication. And churches, again, are intensely social places. And so if you have a condition that impacts your ability to process, for example, body language, facial expression, tone of voice, inflection of voice, and if you miss out on different social cues, it becomes very hard to stay like engaged, and to become assimilated into like the daily life of that church. So again, like making small talk with people coming and going, dealing with the challenges of being in a small group or serving together with other people would all be challenging. The sixth is social isolation. in that, like, when you think about, well, how do people get invited to your church? Um, Oftentimes it's because someone who's already part of a church invited them. But like, when you think about parents who have kids with like mental health issues, they just can't hire like any babysitter down the street to come in, and watch their kids. So they may have a more difficult time finding childcare. They may be spending a significant portion of their income on different treatments or therapies for their child. So they may not have like the discretionary income, to be able to be out doing the kinds of things with other families that allows them to build relationships and make connections with like other folks in the church. Or like, you think about adults who wrestle with this. We know that, again, one of the primary symptoms of depression is that oftentimes folks who are depressed will begin to like withdraw and pull away from other people and pull away from activities when they start to become like symptomatic in terms of their mood issues. And so, part of the issue here is that, a lot of times, because of the social isolation that results from having the mental health condition or having a child with that condition, folks aren't involved with the activities, and they're not having like the day-to-day kinds of contacts that will result in either them or their child being invited to church. Then if you look at the next slide, probably the seventh barrier is past experiences of church. In that a lot of folks, like, one of the things that you'll find is that a lot of people maybe had attended church at one point but had a bad experience related to like one of these impediments, and as a result they didn't go back. One of the things I learned about 30 minutes into child psychiatry school is that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and that kids with mental health issues oftentimes have parents with mental health issues. And so there was an interesting study a couple of years ago that showed that the likelihood as a young adult that a teenager would regularly attend church who never went in their teen years is around 3%. So that what we end up seeing is, because of sort of the inherited nature of mental illness, sort of these multi-generational kinds of patterns where, if the parents had a struggle where they were unable to attend church, it's very unlikely that their children will ever see the inside of a church. So if you go on to the next slide. Okay,
Hey,
so
Dr. G, I got a question for you that actually popped into the polling, and you can take this or leave this, but we're going into this season where some churches are opening up to, the post-COVID pandemic moment, opening their doors again. What opportunities do you feel like we have to capitalize on what you're already teaching us today to become a more inclusive church, especially at this time in our human history?
Okay, so I think a couple of issues related specifically to the pandemic is that, you look at like some of the data that's come out from like the Barna group, where, particularly like among young adults, like 50% of folks haven't been back to church since the beginning of the pandemic. And there are a lot of folks who aren't going to be coming back. And I had seen some statistics that in places that have reopened, church attendance is 36% of like what it was like prior to COVID-19. Yeah. I think that there's going to be a sense of urgency on the part of a lot of our church leaders about filling the pews back up after this is all over. And so again, like, when you think about underserved people groups, who are like living within 2 to 5 miles of your church, if 1 in 5 Americans is wrestling with a mental health issue, and if those mental health issues up to this point in time have kept so many of them from being a part of church, I mean, it seems to me that this is like, like a marvelous opportunity, as we refocus upon like evangelism and outreach, to make connections with a group of people who need to hear the gospel, need to come to faith in Jesus Christ, and need the support of being a part of a loving church family. So again, if I were lead pastor of a church, that I would be looking specifically at this group in terms of, sort of an untapped population that, that very much needs like what we have to share as a church. And
well,
so
thank you. That's great.
Transition into okay, well, what do we do about this kind of issue? the foundation of basically our mental health ministry model is that we would work with churches around how do you identify within each different area of ministry or each ministry department the things that are likely to get in the way of people with common mental health conditions being able to assimilate and to engage in those activities. And basically what we're trying to do is that we're trying to help church staff, pastors, key volunteers sort of put themselves in the shoes of an individual or a family who has like a significant mental health condition and start to anticipate the things that are going to get in the way before they actually do get in the way. And so in the same way that we talked about 7 barriers, basically there are 7 strategies that we would share with churches in terms of how you tackle something like this. The first is that you want to be able to put together like an inclusion team, and you want leaders from each different area of your church, to be part of this team and, to be sharing their input and actively engaged. So that historically, for example, our ministry had focused on helping churches welcome families of children with disabilities. I don't have a whole lot of 9-year-olds in my child psychiatry practice who are going to drive themselves to church. So that basically you have to be able to serve everyone in the family if we're going to do good mental health inclusion. And so that the people on this team, that you need to have representatives from, your worship ministry, your children's ministry, your student ministry, your adult ministry, your small group ministry, even folks you wouldn't think about, like folks, for example, on your facilities team. When you start thinking about sensory issues and the nature of the spaces in which ministry takes place. So like the second strategy is are there things about the spaces where we do worship and where we do Christian education where we can make them more welcoming and friendly? It's like focusing on how do we get people involved in the specific experiences and activities at church that are most likely to, to facilitate the discipleship process and helping them to grow spiritually. So if, for example, in your church, you find that people grow by getting them involved with a small group, how do we train our small group leaders to be able to help folks who have these issues become more welcome? If it involves your fabulous pastor and getting them there, for weekend worship services so that they can hear the teaching at sermons, how do we make the Sunday morning experience more welcoming and more inviting? If it's involving folks in service activities out in the community or being missional, how do we find roles where everybody can participate and engage and serve in that, in a way in which they feel comfortable? The fourth issue, and I'll touch on this a little bit in terms of some creative thing churches have done, is that how we talk about this is critically important in terms of dispelling the stigma that's out there, and developing a mental health communication strategy, becomes very important as a component of what you're doing with mental health inclusion. Providing practical kinds of helps for families with some of their most heartfelt needs. Offering mental health education to the people, on staff at a church, volunteering at church, and mental health supports to individuals and families within the church and families in the larger community is important. And then when I think about the best inclusion strategy, probably the best strategy for someone who's struggling with a mental health issue coming to church for the first time, is to have someone who's already part of the church and is a friend, come alongside them and be able to help them navigate whatever challenges that they would be likely to experience the first few times that they attend, before they're fully comfortable. And so when you think about, again, the sheer numbers of people who are wrestling with these mental health struggles, pretty much everybody who's already part of your church, has a friend, a family member, a neighbor, a coworker who's impacted. Helping them take ownership of this ministry and helping them to think about what they can do, to care for and to show the love of Christ and support the people who are wrestling with this, wherever they've been placed in their day-to-day activities, becomes a very critical component of this. And so when we talked about, and we threw this out as part of the questions, like the attributes of a mental health friendly church, if we were putting together like a map on our website and said, okay, here are the places that we recommend you go to church-wise, if you're an individual or you're a family who's struggling with this, the 5 things that we would look for would be this. One, that the leadership of the church would be able to document that they have gone through some sort of an intentional planning process in terms of how they would welcome and include people. Secondly, that church had made some formal effort, to get their leaders more education, to get their volunteers more education on some of the challenges that individuals have with these mental health conditions. The third would be that the church would have a defined mental health communication strategy. How do we talk about this, like when we're together as a body, and how do we communicate this to people in the surrounding community? The fourth would be that they would be offering some concrete types of practical help to families who are affected. And so, like, some examples of this would be that when our ministry, when we were actively involved in terms of helping churches develop like respite care for kids, the majority of kids who would be served by that respite care were families who had kids with primary mental health issues. One of the things where in the Lifeway study that you had cited earlier, where there was an enormous disconnect, was that in their study, 70% of pastors believed that their church had an up-to-date referral list for where to send individuals and families if they were having a mental health struggle. Well, only a little under 30% of families reported that their churches were actually prepared to be able to follow through with that. And then, like, our most popular blog post on Key Ministry website 5 years ago was entitled, "We Had No Casseroles." And this was based off of there was a 60 Minutes interview where they were talking with a number of parents of teens and young adults about their struggles being able to access mental health services in Northern Virginia. And one of the moms who was being interviewed had commented that when their 13-year-old daughter broke her leg in a skiing accident and was in the hospital for a week, every single night someone from the church brought a casserole or provided food to their family. 6 months later, when their daughter got depressed and overdosed and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a week, there were no casseroles. And so do we minister to folks in the same way when they're dealing with a mental health concern that we do when they're having a medical illness? And then the fifth piece of this would be, that the church would offer some sort of mental health specific education and support group for their members or for people in the surrounding community. And so I just want to touch on a few highlights before we wrap this up in terms of like some neat things that churches have done, to be able to address some of these issues. We were at a very, very large church. This is probably 2 years ago now, training probably 250 volunteers as part of like what they were doing with their mental health ministry efforts. And, so I went to like the worship service the next day, and it was interesting. Senior pastor, who wasn't part of all of this, started off the worship service like, welcome to blank, blank, blank church. I'd like to start off by, praying for anybody here today who's struggling with depression. Something as simple as that, empowers people and makes them comfortable. Like, if the pastor's talking about this, it's okay for me to be able to talk about it. That there are, one of the ways that, we had a church here in Cleveland that we had worked with that won an award from our local NAMI group for what they were doing with, their mental health strategy. Part of how they kicked it off was that their pastor did a 5-message sermon series on what the Bible teaches about anxiety. One of the things that they did that was so cool was that they made up like a 5-minute Facebook video where the founding pastor of the church, got on and said, "Hi, my name's Rick Duncan. I'm the founding pastor of Cuyahoga Valley Church. And I want you to know that folks with mental health struggles are welcome at our church. We know what this is like. My father was a pastor. He struggled with depression. We don't want you to suffer without the benefits of Christian community." And they put that out. They put it on their Facebook page, and they did that so that their members could share it with other people in the community to help dispel, sort of this perception that folks with mental health struggles aren't welcome at church. A Sunday that I was there to train their children's ministry and student ministry volunteers, during the worship service, they had a 3-minute video in which they featured one of the guys who played in their worship band as he talked about his experience with severe panic disorder and how that impacted him in terms of his, in terms of his relationship with Jesus and his walk. In terms of like different mental health education and support tools, with regard to training for pastors, we offer all kinds of like workshops, video webinars, addressing this topic. This is part of how you guys are stepping in, as a Lutheran Foundation in terms of meeting this need now. So it could be, watching sessions like this. It could be training pastors and church staff on the principles of psychological or mental health first aid. It could be education for people at the church who are serving and volunteering on trauma-informed care. There are a couple of wonderful ministries that we work with very closely. One is called Fresh Hope, and the other is called Mental Health Grace Alliance, that have put together Christian-based mental health support models for teens and adults with pretty much every manner of mental illness. And they're now at the point, that these are operating in hundreds of churches, with each organization around the country and increasingly internationally. One of the opportunities I've had a chance to be invited to, to preach at or to be part of are mental health awareness Sundays. And so, if maybe a pastor, doesn't have firsthand experience with this, or they're looking for someone to speak into the issue, maybe having a pastor from another church or having somebody who has had this struggle get up, speak about it during worship services. It's been a wonderful opportunity for outreach. And I was part of one of these things where they actually had sort of a church town meeting between worship services on a Sunday morning. And folks from the church sort of sharing their stories. And, it was incredibly impactful in terms of how it helped people attending their church sort of get a better sense of the struggles, and get their brain around this. The church that I happened to attend did like several sort of like open Zoom meetings specifically like during COVID to talk about how, how issues related to COVID were impacting their mental health, in which they featured different counselors who were on staff at the church. I did one of these things together with one of the psychologists from our practice, with the lead pastor with another church, in the city, talking about mental health issues at Christmas time during COVID. There's a large church here in Ohio, for example, that is now subletting space in the church to one of their community mental health agencies. So people who come to the church, are able to access services on site. There's a great ministry called Kesed Wellness, which is started by Chuck Swindoll's granddaughter out in Colorado, where part of what they do is that they find churches in urban areas with empty space, and that counselors provide mental health services to clients for a reduced fee in those churches in exchange for the free office space. And so, like, when we think about what are the key principles behind an effective mental health inclusion strategy? One, this is a mindset, not a program. That what folks with mental health struggles want more than anything else is that they want to be able to do what everybody else is doing. And that any kind of like a program or something that calls attention to them as being different, is doomed to failure. The kids with mental health issues have parents with mental health issues. And so it's essential that this be thought of as a family ministry, and that we need to be prepared to help and support and welcome every member of the family, whatever age they might be, with a mental health struggle. Because if mom and dad aren't able to go to church, the kids aren't going to be coming to church. A good mental health inclusion strategy is probably something that benefits everybody and doesn't require anyone to self-identify. because part of why this has been such a challenging population to serve is that these are truly hidden disabilities. And again, that this is a ministry that ideally is owned by the people and supported by the staff. So, I'd like to encourage anybody who is interested in learning more about this, to reach out to us at Key Ministry. We have all kinds of resources, supports. The lovely Miss Catherine Boyle is part of our group today. Catherine is our mental health ministry director. And so, totally free of charge, she's prepared to sort of come alongside anyone who's interested in starting up a mental health inclusion strategy, being able to offer wisdom, advice, resources, and support. And so, my hope is that you wouldn't walk away from this thinking that, wow, this is just like a really cool idea and then not do something about it. I want you to feel burdened by this and to feel like you need to act. So feel free to reach out. I'm Steve at keyministry.org. It's Catherine at keyministry.org for our mental health ministry director. Check out our website. We have an entire library of videos to walk church staff through this process step by step. And we would just feel honored and blessed if we're able to come alongside you and help you as you start to do ministry with and outreach to this population. So thank you.
Dr. G, thank you. This was an incredible presentation, and we have our question box now open for any of our participants that might have a question for Dr. G. And as you type those in, I have a question, like I usually do when I hear great speakers like yourself. My wife and I have 4 kids. We like to be a family on mission. We like to do things where we can together as a family focus on a specific need. Give us some thoughts about how a family could own this inclusion strategy and how they could partner with other families that perhaps are struggling in the church or struggling with their own children. What does that look like to have kids helping kids and parents helping parents?
Okay, so one of the things that, one of the strategies I've seen used in some smaller churches, and something we did for a while in our own church, is the notion of relational respite, where in our church, for example, a small group might come alongside a family of a child with a mental health issue. And I can think about one of the women, she'd been our children's ministry director and used to be on our ministry board. Their small group had adopted a family that had a teenage daughter with schizophrenia. And one day, so she comes over to the house, just to visit, check on her. Mom was really overwhelmed because the kid was having a rough day. Libby's service to the family was picking up a mop and helping mom finish scrubbing the kitchen floor, because that's what she was struggling with at the time, that their child started having some issues. It might involve, in some instances, a couple from the church coming over and being willing to being willing to come over the house and babysit so that the parents get a night out with one another. It could be something for example, that the unaffected sibling of the kid with the mental health issue, a kid with autism, gets invited to go to the baseball game with another family in the church that they wouldn't normally go to because maybe from a sensory standpoint, it was too overwhelming, and so, one of the ways that a family can reach out would be to identify folks within their sphere of influence, just start meeting their needs as you see and identify their needs. And when it's a small group in a church, it's a way of sort of driving the families into the social infrastructure of the church. So that's one way, when I think about it, that I've seen couples or families be very powerful and very effective in their ministry.
Well, that's fantastic. Those are great thoughts and advices there. So what we want to do now is we want to give you participants a chance to give us some feedback about today's presentation. We're going to be doing some trivia, like I mentioned. Hope you're paying attention to Dr. G's presentation because there's lots of meat there. So we're going to get to those 5 questions here in a little bit. But I do want to give you a chance to be able to evaluate the presentation. We love feedback, and so we're going to keep these results off the screen, but we do want you to be able to anonymously kind of tell us how you felt about today. We're really thankful for the constant dialogue that we have with those of you that attend these LookUp education webinars, because we want to not only continue to improve them, but we also want to address topics that you're passionate about. You're going to get a chance today to actually give us some feedback about future topics that you might like to have us address, like we've had today with Dr. G. So thank you for giving us that feedback. And then also, we want to make sure that you're engaged about future events. And maybe what we could do while they answer these evaluation questions, Dennis, is you could kind of talk a little bit about some of the future events that we have coming up in regards to what's being offered through LookUp Education Series.
Yeah, I'll just mention that in May, and the date is May the 6th. We're going to do a presentation on spiritual first aid that is being offered by the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton College. Actually, there is a training for spiritual first aid that you can take on their website, and we ask people to do that ahead of time. And then the director of the Institute is going to then walk us through for a few hours of how you can apply that in your ministry and in your situation. So it's really an expanded version of that training. So we really encourage people to take the training ahead of time and then join us for that webinar, a few hours for that webinar, as Dr. Ayton walks us through how can you utilize that in your church and your ministry context.
Excellent. That's great. Okay, well, as promised, Dr. G is still with us, so we're going to do some trivia / quiz. I call it a quiz. You know, I was that student in class that needed to have a quiz at the end to make sure I was paying attention. So here's 5 questions that we have. Again, you have 20 seconds to answer each of these. And so be looking at your screen, ready to do that with that pointer finger. First question that we have for you is this. What percentage of children and adults currently meet criteria for at least one mental health disorder? What percentage of children and adults currently meet criteria for at least one mental health disorder? Is that 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, or 30%? And our answer is, indeed, 20%. So, all right. So 20% of children and adults currently meet criteria for at least one mental health disorder. And it looks like Exciting Galaxy at the top of the leaderboard. Let's keep going. This is another good question here. Having a child with ADHD reduces the likelihood of the family ever setting foot in a church by what percentage? Is it 10%, 20%, 40%, 60%, and 80%? And I don't know, did Dr. G give us all these facts? Were you writing all these down? Were you taking notes?
I was not taking notes.
We're not taking notes.
But I remember this one.
This is a good one. Well, believe it or not, again, 20%. 20% of families will not even set foot in a church if they have a child with ADHD. Fantastic that today we learned how we can be a more inclusive church family. Let's go to this next question. Having a child with an anxiety disorder reduces the likelihood of the family ever setting foot in a church by what percentage? If ADHD was that last question, what about an anxiety disorder? 15%, 30%, 45%, 60%, or 70%. And this is staggering. 45% is the correct answer. It reduces the likelihood of that family ever setting foot in a church. We truly do have a great opportunity here to be the bride of Christ.
Absolutely.
And to love people, especially in this crazy time, in this pandemic season. Okay, 2 more questions left. Diligent Pony, oh my goodness, Diligent Pony at the top of the leaderboard. Having a child with depression reduces the likelihood of that family ever setting foot in a church. Again, by what percentage? 15%, 30%, 45%, 60%, or 75%. And it gets absolutely just overwhelming to think 75% of families would not set in foot in a church because of having a child that's dealing with depression. So again, those pastors watching, how vulnerable we need to be when we're in the pulpit to make sure that those families feel welcome within our congregation. Okay, last question. Neat Ruby at the top of the board here. And this was, I remember this one. I took notes on this one. According to Lifeway research, what blank percent of unchurched adults believe persons with mental illnesses are unwelcome at a church? And I remember at one of our task force meetings years ago, you referenced this statistic. 55%, 42%, 38%, or 28%. And again, if you were taking notes, you remember that it was 55%. So looks like Sensible Stallion. Sensible Stallion 56, congratulations. But of course, we got 3 books to give away. So Neat Ruby and Energetic Gator, you are our top 3 winners today. Good job, well done, way to pay attention. Dennis, over to you to thank Dr. G before we close our time together.
Yeah, Dr. G, thank you very much. I really appreciate what you've shared with us today. 2 words come to my mind. It's not a program, and it's more of a mindset. It's a mindset for ministry, so it's not a program we develop. But everything you talked about was extremely practical. I really appreciate how practical that is, that you gave some specifics of what every church really could be doing. And Clinton, if there was a checklist that we could put together, are you doing this? Are you doing this, doing this? I think we got some beginning steps for that today from what he shared. And so I just really thank you, appreciate the relationship that we've been able to establish, Dr. G, with you, and look forward to more about what Key Ministry is doing and how we can partner together. Clinton, as always, it's great to be with you, and thank you to Remedy Live and to you for being our host for this.
Well, I'm grateful to do so. I want to remind all of you that are watching, great resources at lookupindiana.org. If you've not visited, you need to go there. We've got a graphic we can put up there in regards to some faith-based resources. This video will post there shortly, so you'll be able to watch this. And I just recommend you gather a few of your key leaders in the church and start dreaming an inclusion strategy. And maybe even working with Key Ministries to make that a possibility. But again, thank you so much. You're going to have some feedback questions as we end our time, so don't log out yet, because we do want your feedback, especially about some ideas that might be good that we can be thinking about for future webinar events together. But again, thank you,
Clinton,
Dennis.
let me jump in.
Oh, okay,
Let me just jump in real quick.
There you go.
You mentioned the website, and I want to mention that just yesterday we posted a mental health toolkit.
That's right.
For churches to utilize. And there's a lot of resources on there. It's a great sermon on there.
Okay, good. Is
It's
it your
a shameless
sermon?
plug. But a good Bible study. So just some resources that we just hope that churches will give some attention during the month of May to Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yeah.
And do some things in a church related to that. Talk about that, as Dr. G mentioned.
The feedback I'm already getting, the practical information question, this is going to have some residuals in a good way. So again, thank you, Dr. G, for joining us today. Say hi to the sunny weather in your neighborhood, and please continue to do all that you're doing to push the church in the right direction.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I look forward to maybe coming out to Indiana sometime soon and being part of a live event with y'all.
We plan on you doing that for our LookUp conference in 2022, May of 2022. We're going to nail down an exact date here pretty quick, but to our audience, that is our plan to do the next LookUp Mental Health Conference here in Fort Wayne, May of 2022. More information to come.
All right. Until then, friends, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
1 in 5 Americans struggle with mental illness in the United States. And for many of them, they struggle in secret, surrounded by friends, family members, and people they work with each and every day. The Wired Experience is a 1-hour program, provided virtually or in person, that engages adults in the importance of answering a very important question. How are you? Really? Through the interactive polling software that Remedy Live created, we get people talking. The Wired Experience helps organizations big and small talk about the tough issues of secret struggle, provide important information about mental health and the network of care, and get a data snapshot of the trends within the organization so further resources can be provided to serve their people. Thanks to courageous leaders partnering with the Wired podcast, the Wired Experience is serving organizations and making a difference in the conversation around mental health. Together, we can see the mental health stigma lowered and people moved from their secret struggle and into the freedom offered through the network of care.